Privatization and globalization. So this is going to be a very interesting topic. At the time of nationalization, we had about 52 nationalized banks. Now, what is a direct tax? A direct tax is one which is collected directly from the person. Now, in India, we don't believe in the concept called as voluntary disclosure of income. When you are doing production in your own country, there is nobody to challenge you. Good morning and welcome to the second session of Liberalization, Privatization and Globalization. This is a very interesting chapter, and we were trying to understand about the various economic reforms and the factors that are being governing the entire system. So moving forward, let's have a quite close look at what are the topics that we are going to cover today. The topics include the financial sector reforms, one of the major reforms that the government ever tried to make in India. The tax reforms that we are talking about. Then we were talking about the foreign exchange reform. How did the foreign exchange come up altogether? Trade and investment reforms. Privatization and globalization. So this is going to be a very interesting topic because we are going to see some of the most important factors that have changed the Indian economy altogether. Now let's move forward and try to understand each one of them in depth. Now, the first thing that I would like to take upon is the financial sector reforms. Financial sector is the lifeline of any economy. So it's the banks and the financial institutions that run the economy altogether. If the banks and the institutions are not able to fund the government at any given point of time, automatically the economy cracks down. The economy is not able to come out, liberate and start going up. So that is why the economy is always in need of money. The economy always needs a financial push which will keep it running and healthy. Now, if you look into the financial sector of India, at the time of nationalization, we had about 52 nationalized banks and a couple of private and cooperative banks. But after 1991, that was a time when you could see that private banks were given license to operate. Rather than using the word license, I would again go back and say that was a time when the private banks were given the opening to start up. So when you see with banks like HDFC, ICICI, all of them started coming at that junction altogether. So the involvement of financial sector, regularization of financial sector gave a very big push to the economy because that was the regulatory feature. That was the most important thing. That was the most important push that the economy could ever think about. Because of that, the investment banks, stock exchanges, markets started propelling. Why? Because people could now start trading, people could now start opening up accounts, the savings, the deposits started moving up. So this sector reform is considered to be a very important turning point in terms of the Indian economy. The second thing, the financial sector is completely controlled by RBI. That is the central authority that controls all the banks and financial institutions. So the role of RBI was not just a monitor or a supervisor, but to have a complete authority in terms of the rates, in terms of interest, in terms of every single operation that a banks need to do. So RBI took a central charge. RBI's ideology started moving ahead. It was not just now a statutory body, but it started becoming a controlling body on the financial sector. It wanted to have a supreme control saying that how the banks need to work, where they need to work, and what kind of factors they need to work upon. So RBI's role started changing from a monitor to that of a leader altogether. The next thing, RBI also started deciding the amount of money, the interest rate, all the sectoral reforms that you can think about in financial sector was completely held under the control of RBI. So the role of RBI became a pivotal importance in terms of guiding the economy to the next league altogether. One of the major aims of the financial sector reforms was to reduce the RBI from a regulator to facilitator of financial. This word I want you to focus a lot. Why? Because I don't just want to be a regulator. I don't want to be a monitor sitting in some corner of the world and just looking at the banks. I want to be a person who could guide the banks, who could guide the financial institution, who could guide the market and say that these are the norms and regulations under which you need to work. RBI has got a lot of expertise in terms of banking, economics and the policies altogether. So RBI should get more involved in terms of coming front and telling the banks what you exactly need, how to drive your deposits, how to drive your advances, how to make better collections and how to improve the loan and credit facilities. So that's why the government wanted RBI to open up the doors. Government wanted an image shift onto the RBI. Next, this also meant that the financial sector may be allowed to take decision on many matters concerning with the RBI and also sometimes without even the RBI, which means to say that RBI's role is not like a mandatory anymore. RBI's role will become more of a consulting role altogether. There were times before 1991 where RBI has to nod its head for each and every single action taken on the economy. Now the government wanted RBI to be on the consulting role. RBI should be on a factor where they just provide ideas and do not become too rigid on the banking sector or on the financial sector reform. So that's why the financial sector reform, with the introduction of private banks, foreign banks coming into the Indian scenario, the whole gamut of banking transactions started changing. People started looking banking with even more positive approach. The loans and credit facilities were made available at easier rates. The flow of credit cards, debit cards, ATM and all kind of financial sector reforms started pushing the money to the hands of the consumers. So that was a very big change that we brought to the Indian economy altogether. Now, moving forward, the financial sector reforms, which we continue in terms of understanding the policies in establishment of private sector as well as the foreign banks, which we were talking about. Foreign investment in banks was raised to around 50%. This is a very, very important thing. With the introduction of foreign banks coming into India, like Citibank, HSBC, JP Morgan, or even you think about Bank of America, all these banks, when they started coming into India, our ideology was that they also participate in corporate banking, in retail banking, and make India even more effective ground for banking. So we raised the limit up to 50%. That means we wanted an equity. We wanted to have an equality in terms of Indian versus the foreign companies. Though they were not listed in India, they were listed elsewhere in the globe, but we gave them an opportunity to open branches in India, get them more customers, and start promoting the financial sector reform altogether. Similarly, those banks which fulfill the criteria and conditions that have been laid down by the RBI, the norms and regulations being maintained by the RBI, we started giving them the permission to expand and open new branches. Now, if you look at the expansion system, other than the government-owned banks like SBI, Bank of Baroda, Canara Bank and other sectors, private banks like HDFC, ICICI Bank, IDBI, so many banks started opening up their branches because they wanted to attract the rural India. They wanted to attract the tier 2 and tier 3 cities of India, where they started seeing a growing population and a need for the financial sector reform. So that is where now you would see that an internal competition started growing between the banks. The bank sector started feeling that this is the time where we need to perform with better technology, with better amenities, with better facilities, keeping the customer in mind, and nowhere we can go back, relax and say that yes, the government will take care of everything. The government has now opened the sector for the banking and financial reform, stating that you need to be internally competitive and the performance will be counted at each and every level. So that makes the entire banking sector even more interesting altogether. Though the banks have been given permission in terms of opening up in India and abroad, certain aspects have to be retained. So if you look at that, RBI did provide certain guidelines, and it said that you will not be able to move here and there in terms of foreign exchange. That was completely kept in control of the RBI, and with that permission, we started moving forward in terms of building up our forex, in terms of making our bank truly international altogether. The FIIs, this is very, very important where I want you to focus. The foreign institutional investors, these were the people who were looking upon India as the emerging market, as a market of investment altogether. So most of the FIIs wanted to see that India becomes their home ground of investment. So most of the foreign investors came to India, they looked into the markets, they found that this market was highly emerging, highly coming up. So what they did, they just took up that factor and started investing in India. Now what we did is that we gave them permission to invest through mutual funds, through equities, and through various instruments through which we could attract that foreign money into India. So the role of FIIs, the foreign institutional investors, played a very big importance in terms of pushing the economy all forward. So this factor has to be kept in mind, and this is a very, very important turning point that comes to the economics altogether. Now moving forward, the tax reforms. One debatable area in India whenever we talk about budget and GDP factors, the taxation reform is very, very important. We have always been struggling with the tax reforms. Why? Because when you look at the tax slab of India, it is always somewhere the common man gets squeezed completely. So if you look at the tax reforms, we were more concerned with the government's taxation and public expenditure policies altogether. Why? Because if you look at the fiscal policy, the expenditure, what I am talking about, government had to spend money at each and every instance, at each and every year, to see that the policies are implemented for the benefit of the people. Now for the government, the revenue directly comes from tax. So if they are not able to collect tax, they will not be able to implement their program. So the government wanted to increase the tax slabs. The government wanted to make the tax slabs proactive and collect as much money as possible. But for a common man in India, the income factors and the tax factors are two different things. He does not get a constant improvement in income on a day-to-day basis or on a monthly basis. There are many times when a common man, when a salaried person does not get a hike in the salaries, does not get a hike in his income altogether. So at that point of time, introduction of higher tax reforms will definitely hurt the common man. So that is why the government was very, very hesitant in terms of increasing the tax reform, making it change. But then, now what happened is that with the scenario of liberalization coming in, they had to bring in certain reforms in taxes so that they will be able to do better and the revenue of the country will also improve. Now there are two types of taxes that we need to concentrate upon. One is called as a direct and the second one is called as the indirect tax. Now what is a direct tax? A direct tax is one which is collected directly from the person, in the sense it is the income taxes altogether. Now the income which is earned by the individual directly in the form of doing business or in the form of occupation will be directly collected from the government at a particular rate depending upon his income. On the other hand, indirect taxes that we have been talking about are your custom, duty, tax and all those factors. But when you look at this indirect tax, there was a lot of tax evasions that used to happen in our country because people were not clear about the way the business is done and they were not transparent enough in producing the bills, in filing the tax returns altogether. So one side in the taxation reform, though the direct tax was providing some sort of revenue to the government, the collections went on going up, but the other side, the indirect taxes like for example customs, duties, sales tax was not being promoted, was not being collected because of the evasion problem. So the tax reforms did not truly set up from 1991 to 2000. That 10 years we were struggling with the tax reforms. But after 2001, 2002, we set up the norms very clearly and we started improving on the tax reforms. In the current year, from 2014-15 onwards, once the establishment of GST came in 16, we have really improved on our collections very well, and today India is one of the leading tax collectors in the world with a huge amount of revenue coming all together. So that is our tax reform history that we have been taking place from the year 91 till 2020. Now moving forward, the tax reform also needs to be understood or accepted that a moderate rate of income which will also lead to savings and voluntary disclosure of income. Now in India, we don't believe in the concept called as voluntary disclosure of income unless and until it is provided directly by the employer himself. Many people try to hide their income or try to put their income in such a manner that they are below the income tax slab. This leads to a problem in the country. Why? Because the government is not able to collect enough taxes from people. Many people escape away from the tax bracket. So this leads to a lot of problem in terms of collection. So the rate of corporation tax, which was very high earlier, has been considerably reduced. Efforts have been made to make the reform direct in terms of commodities, in terms of the establishment, and a national market was also established for goods and commodity. At some point of time, we also started understanding that yes, the tax rates are higher, the common man is getting affected, and there needs to be a system, there needs to be a process through which everybody can get benefited. So what we tried to do first is that we started looking around at the facilities, like for example, the corporation tax in terms of land tax, road tax, water tax, all those kind of things we wanted to reduce, we wanted to stabilize the system so that, you know, the common man starts feeling comfortable in terms of his payments and other factors. Similarly, we also wanted to see that when it comes to the income tax, we wanted the companies to start filing the income tax of the employers so that the government will exactly come to know what is the income earned by that particular person. So we wanted to bring in this voluntary disclosure of income scheme, giving the citizens a facility, a platform to go ahead and declare tax by themselves. That will make the system transparent and also the government on an easier mode to understand how the citizens are performing in terms of their earning capacity. So that was the intention of the government altogether in order to bring in this tax reform. Next one. The another component of this reform are the area of simplification. We wanted tax to be an understandable subject. For many of us, even now, even today, tax is something like a rocket science. It's a complicated subject. If you go and ask anybody, sir, how is income tax calculated? Most of us would feel that income tax is the most complicated subject. It cannot be explained. We just want to understand, we just want to know further, saying that how income tax is working. So the government of India took an initiative saying that we will make tax slab wise. 10%, 20%, 30%, so that everybody is covered under the slab. Everybody understands how they are being taxed upon the income they are earned. So our aim was to make tax an accessible subject altogether. And in order to encourage better compliance on the part of taxpayer, many procedures have been simplified. Now, I would like to mention you on this particular area that the income tax portal of Government of India, if you happen to visit through it, you can go through it. It's incometax.gov.in. It's one of the very, very useful websites which will take you step by step in terms of filling up the income tax form, and it will also tell you what are the areas under which you can get a tax relief. So the ideology of government right from 1991 onwards is to go more towards the consumers, go towards the citizen, make them understand the importance of paying tax and make the process simplified so that everybody participate and they also understand what is the transparency that goes on in terms of income tax. So this has today helped a lot of people. We have now started going on the e-filing of income tax. You automatically get a message to your inbox saying that you have filed your income tax, and you are also able to track your application. You are also able to track your refunds. So the government has now made tax filing a very, very interesting subject and an innovative tool altogether. So this is why today you see that in India, most of the corruption levels have come down and people have started involving in paying their income taxes regularly. Now, let's move forward. Foreign exchange reserves and the reforms altogether. Now, foreign exchange is always a subject of great interest. How do we earn foreign money? Now, staying in India, let's say that you're going to start earning in dollars, is a very, very interesting topic, and definitely anybody would like to do that. But then for a country, the same kind of scenario also starts coming. We as in Indians, we have always aspired that India should become the most preferred destination for foreign direct investment, and we have always been striving hard to make it happen. Now, the first important reform that we took in the external sector was the foreign exchange market. We want this exchange market to be as liberal, as simplified and transparent as far as possible. That's how the foreign exchange market will become competitive and also liberative altogether. In 1991, we took this first step. In order to measure, to resolve the balance of payment, the rupee was devalued against the foreign currency. We brought the value of rupee down in comparison to the dollar altogether. Whether this step was right or wrong is a matter of debate. It's a matter of question. But what was the intention of the government at that point of time is to make the rupee weaker for some time and increase the value of dollar. Moment the value of dollar goes up, that means the export value will go up and the foreign exchange reserves will come back to India. So we took a step by ourselves by putting the rupee down and taking the dollar up. This will help in terms of bringing the foreign exchange back to our country. It also started setting a tone to free the determination of rupee value and put the rupee onto the exchange market. Now, rupee started becoming an international currency in the open market, trying to compete against some of the biggest currencies of the world, like the pound, like the yen, the dollar, or the dinar, or any other currency. Rupee also started becoming an international currency. We wanted this to happen. Why? Because let the rupee be valued by the market rather than the country itself. For every single citizen of this country, rupee is of the highest value. Even 1 rupee has its own value. But the value of rupee, when it is looked at the international market, has got a different perspective altogether. So we want every one of us to make rupee an open competitive platform where we can challenge against the dollar, the yen, or any other currency altogether to see how are we faring. So the first liberalization measure in 1991 was to devalue rupee, open it up and leave it in the market. And more efforts were taken where markets were allowed to determine the exchange rate based on the exports, based on the demand supply of foreign exchange. Now, the concept of demand supply, as I said, which is the key concept of economics, started coming into the foreign exchange. What is the demand for dollar? What is the supply of a currency? Started working in, and because of this, the foreign exchange reserve or the foreign exchange reserve started taking a great shape or a great dimension altogether. Moving forward, we were also talking about the trade and investment policy decisions altogether. A very, very interesting and a challenging topic in economics. Why has the trade and policy regimes to be moved further? What has to be done in order to make the trade even more better? The first thing that we started seeing is liberalization of trade and investment regime was initiated. Why? To increase international competitiveness of industrial production. Now, let's try to understand this concept very clearly. When you are doing production in your own country, there is nobody to challenge you. There is nobody to come and comment on the quality. There is nobody to say anything about you. But when you produce the same product for an international market, there are hundreds and thousands of people who are ready to comment on the quality, who are ready to criticize, who are ready to degrade your entire factor altogether. So at that time, the things become even more challenging because you are not satisfying it for your own citizens, but you are doing it for a global scale altogether. So the competitiveness index of manufacturing, of producing, starts going up. And how can this happen is when you liberalize the entire trade sector, when you open it up, when you go to the industries, when you go to the sectors and say them very clearly, yes, I now want you to start producing for the world. I don't want you to produce for India. I don't want a Maruti to be produced only for India. I want Maruti to be competing against Mercedes-Benz. At that point of time, what happens is that the quality of Maruti will be compared equal to that of Mercedes. The brand value goes up, the equity value goes up. So that's what we wanted to do in liberalization. Open up the doors of the sector and start making everybody believe that India is second to none. India should become the most competitive nation when it comes to trade and investment. investment. Secondly, our aim was to promote the efficiency of local industry. We wanted every single Indian company to be recognized worldwide. Just to give you an example here, Bajaj recently came ahead with a very beautiful advertisement on Pulsar and said that the world's favorite Indian motorcycle. Now that was one of the very beautiful tagline that you can ever think about. Why? Because when Bajaj started manufacturing the Pulsar bike altogether, they had an intention in mind that they should compete with one of the topmost brands in the world. Like for example, you can talk about Kawasaki, or you can talk about Yamaha, you can talk about Aprilia, or you can talk about Suzuki or Honda or any of those levels. But today, yes, Bajaj Pulsar's name is being sold in more than 29 countries across the globe, which means the bike that is being served in India, that is made in India, is being served across the globe. That's exactly what we wanted. Today, Bajaj is not an Indian name, but it is a global name. Similarly, every single company in India, be it TVS, be it Maruti, be it any other company in India, we want that to become a global name. And of course, in the few years we have made it. In the last few years, if you see that Hero Honda, or the Hero motorcycles, the TVS company, all of them have started going global and they've all become a big name worldwide. And in order to protect the domestic industry, India was following a regime of quantitative restriction on imports. This was another important thing that we need to learn when it comes in terms of the trade investment policy. We wanted every single company to have a quantitative restriction on imports. We wanted the imports to reduce and exports to grow up. So we don't want the dependency factor again on that foreign countries coming and saying that, sir, we need your help, but rather let us produce by ourselves and sell it across for the globe. With this, let's move to the next slide. This was an encourage factor. Why? Because if you look again in the trade factors, because through tight control over imports and by keeping them on the higher side altogether. So the imported goods value will be made higher, the pricier factor, more tax were put on that. So people started looking more towards stopping of imports rather than buying more and more. These policies reduce the efficiency and competitiveness, which led to the slow growth of manufacturing sector. Because if you look for the manufacturing sector, we were dependent on lot of global companies for the parts and for the raw materials altogether. So the manufacturing sector suddenly started feeling a growth coming down, a declining trend, saying that we are not getting enough materials, we are not getting enough supplies because imports are getting reduced. So there was a hitch there altogether. But then the trade policies ideology was not to make the manufacturing sector break down or come down. Their ideology was to dismantle of the quantitative restrictions. They wanted to make India an effective destination of investment and not the manufacturing pull down, plus the reduction on tariff rates and removing of licensing. Now, if you look at this, slowly what they started doing is that they reduced the tariff rate. They started promoting the Indian manufacturing sector itself so that we will be able to produce more, we will be able to do more when compared to that of the foreign companies. Now, moving forward, when we talk about the trade investment norms and the factors, the other thing that we need to look was the import licensing, which was abolished except for certain hazardous chemicals and the rare products altogether, because importing license was not being given to everybody. That was completely restricted. And the restrictions on import manufactured consumer goods were also fully removed from April 2001, especially on the agricultural sector, because we felt that somewhere down the lane too much of restriction will make the economy break down. So what we did is that quantitative restrictions on imports of manufactured consumer goods and agriculture products were also fully removed from April 2021. The export duties have been removed in order to increase the competitive position of goods in international trade market. So we also removed the export duties. We felt that too much of export duties will reduce our competitiveness, will reduce our schemes altogether. So we went ahead and we said that we are going to reduce it, we are going to completely remove it, and this helped the export sector to have a greater benefit altogether. Moving forward, the privatization concept. The privatization is a very, very interesting factor where we are trying to shred the ownership of the government and start moving more towards the private sector. We want the dependency on government to come down. So that's why we say the ownership or management of government-owned enterprise. India has the feeling, or the Indian citizens always have a feeling, that a government job, a government sector is a very secured sector. We never wanted privatization and capitalism drive happening in India. So we never wanted to promote those private companies and make India a completely a private organization driven. But on the other hand, the government said at some point of time, having too many public sector unions will not work because it will just become a direct dependency and the performance might come down. So they wanted to promote the private companies. So how did the government do it? They can be converted into private companies in two ways. Now, the first way is that by withdrawal of government from ownership. Now, for example, Indian Railways, tomorrow if the government decides, in fact, you might have read the news that the Indian government wants to privatize railways starting from 2023 onwards. So what does the government wants to do? Dilute the stake. So if you dilute the ownership here and start giving it to the private players, and the next factor is outright sale of public sector companies where you just sell it off. Like for example, HMT, you want to just sell it off, or you want to sell off ITC, the Indian Telephone Company, ITI companies, you just can sell it off to any other private company who's interested in buying it. Automatically that would lead to an outright sale. Now you find that there are certain companies which are not performing to the level. You can sell out those companies and then make a very good money in terms of revenue for that, and also the private companies would be interested because they can take over and start moving forward in terms of economy. So the concept of privatization itself is diluting the ownership and giving it to the hands of the private companies who can perform better and who can deliver the economy to the next level. Now, moving forward, the privatization of the public sector union, this is very, very important, whereby selling the shares and all those factors was called as disinvestment. In fact, in 2001-2003, in the Ministry of NDA, we had an entire sector called the Ministry of Disinvestment, which was very, very important. Why? Because we identified certain companies which need to be dismantled, which need to be sold off because they were not doing good at all. So all the money that could be taken up by the Ministry of Disinvestment could add on to the revenue of India. The purpose of sale, according to the government, was mainly to improve the financial discipline, because once it goes to the hands of the private players, the financial control and monitoring becomes even more stricter and people don't allow it to take it outside at all. It was also looked by the fact that private capital and managerial capabilities could be effectively used, more employment can be generated, and those companies could be converted as the best performing companies altogether. Why? Because in a government sector, in a public sector union altogether, just by the sheer size, the management control was not achieved. And because of that, economically, these companies started becoming weaker. In the other way, in private sector, they used to break it down into smaller size components and bring in an effective management system through which the entire economy can get benefited. Now let's move forward. In privatization, we also thought that the government also made attempts to improve the efficiency by giving them an autonomy. This word is autonomy is very, very important, because now I'm giving you the freedom to make your own decisions. I'm not stopping you. I don't want private organizations or any other organization to come back to government, stand and ask for decisions. You can take your own decisions at the appropriate time and deliver what is needed for the economy. For instance, some PSUs might be granted special status as Navaratnas and Maharatnas. Now, if you start looking at BHEL, one of the most important companies that we can talk about, DRDO, these are all companies which have a great national importance altogether. So the government wanted to give them status of a special levels like Navaratnas, the 9 gems, or the Maharatnas, because they are all a great performing company altogether at that point of time, and they will give some value of national importance. So certain performing companies were kept back by the government. They did not just want to disinvest it, and certain companies where they felt that the performance levels are down, we could probably take out those companies and we could give it out to the hands of the private so that the growth starts happening. In the next level, we are going to talk about globalization, one of the most important topic altogether. Now, moving away from the borders, from the regions of our country, we want to go global. We want to say to the world that yes, we have a right. And that is how we wanted to talk about this globalization, an outcome of policies of liberalization and privatization. Now, we want to go back to the world and say we are here and we are ready to participate at a global level. The second thing, generally it was understood that mean of integration of economy of the country with the world economy. But then if you start understanding here in the true sense, globalization is opening up of your economy in true sense. It is an outcome of set of various policies that are aimed at transformation. The word transformation is very, very important. Why? Because until now, change was never looked as a positive thing in the economy. But from globalization, change is the most important and the positive aspect that we are going to see. So, our factor is that the greater dependence on change. The moment we keep changing ourselves as per the need of the world, as per the need of the economy, automatically our country will become the most prosperous country in the world and we will be able to produce more and export more. So, the need of the hour is interdependence, integration with other nations, understanding the requirements, finding out the gaps and producing accordingly so that we will be able to make progress year by year. So interdependence and integration, these two words are going to be a key focus in our mind. It also involves the creation of networks and activities transcending economic, social and geographical boundaries. What is the main thing about globalization is not about the word I, but it's about the word we. What we are going to do in globalization is that we are going to get connected. All the 195 countries in the globe or 200 odd countries in the globe are all the same platform. So India is not going to stand back and say that we are a secluded country. Rather, India is going to come forward, join hands with all the 200 odd countries and make a statement saying that we are ready to promote our products. We are here to serve your needs altogether. So there's not going to be a social barrier, there's not going to be a religious bias, or there's not going to be a color or any kind of bias altogether. We are just going to look at the world as a neutral stand, as a platform of growth altogether. Next, we would also try to attempt on establishing link in such a way that our practices, our ideology are influenced by the world. We want to set a benchmark. We want every single country in this world to follow India as the most happening country. Now, for example, if you look at Ayurveda, a science that we had developed ages before, is now being practiced and appreciated in millions of places across the globe. In hundreds and thousands of people are expanded, and there are a lot of countries who have adopted the practices of Ayurveda and their, the religious factors altogether, which has helped in the healthcare altogether. So similarly, India has got certain unique factors which could be taken up at the global level, showcased, and could become a benchmark of practice altogether. It is also turning the world into one whole, creating borderless world. This was probably one of the most important statements that we need to understand in globalization. No more borders. Borders are only meant for that physical geography map altogether. But for a trade, for an investment, we are not looking at borders at all. Probably sitting in India, we can trade with any other country across the world, because now the world after globalization has become one united village altogether. So all we wanted to see is that we get united, we get integrated, and we start working seamlessly so that we are able to create a global economy for India. Moving forward, with this we come to the conclusion for today's session. I hope and believe that this session was interesting, useful and informative altogether. In the coming sessions, we would be seeing more about the globalization factors under different dimensions, especially on the service sectors and on the manufacturing sector altogether. Until then, stay tuned, stay blessed and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today.